Welcome back to our second Succession podcast for season 3. We are talking about episode 2, Mass in Time of War. Let's jump right into it. This was kind of a part 2 of last week's episode. I think a lot of the same locations and, sort of a continuation of what we saw last week.
Yes, it feels very much like a two-parter that now has set up the season fully now that we've seen both.
So one of the first things we got this episode was it appears that Greg, like so many members of Team Kendall, is beginning to lose faith slightly.
It's a relief to see, I feel, given the first episode, how delusional he seemed about Kendall. It's nice to see that he's having doubts already, though it's also been like a day in their time, perhaps. And Kendall is already accusing him of Judasing him.
Yep, Kendall is like, as a person who has betrayed many, many people, I can recognize the signs, Greg.
Kendall felt a little more grounded in this episode. He was at least reacting when people were not responding well to him. That's nice.
Yeah, he seems to have come down a little bit from the extreme mania that he had last episode and is now a bit more reacting to reality. Let's do Burn of the Week.
That's not a good retort. Don't fucking laugh at that.
Savannah, what was your favorite burn this week?
My favorite burn came from Roman saying about Kendall he remembered his kid's name.
I picked the exact same one and I don't even have a runner-up. This is so sad. I should have had a second one.
Okay, I prepared runner-ups.
Okay,
because
good. I love a crack at absent father Kendall.
I feel like Roman was firing on all cylinders in this episode. It's most acceptable when Roman insults Kendall, and he's also the best at it, I would say. I also really enjoyed his "to learn how you're actually doing, gonna have to wait for you to call a national fucking press conference."
Yeah, all of his jokes about the press conference were pretty good too. So Shiv arrives at Rava's place. I guess everybody kind of figured out that he was at Rava's place this episode. I mean, I'm sure he told Shiv, but it seems like at some point the word has gotten out of where you can find Kendall these days. Shiv arrives, and the first thing that happens that's really interesting is Kendall says that Logan had no other options of who to send to jail, and Shiv is kind of like, yeah, because she told Logan not to send Tom to jail. It was very nearly Tom, but Kendall does not know that. I think he just kind of assumed it had to be him. He didn't know that there were any other serious options, so it was kind of painful seeing Shiv have to pretend like she didn't play a role in that. And I wonder if it may come up again later this season.
Yeah, I'm hoping, because she played a very direct role in it. I feel like Logan was basically leaving it up to her. And despite coaching politicians for a living for a long time, she is not the best liar in her personal life. The face she made when Kendall said that was very telling.
Yeah.
Though he does not seem down to earth enough that he really picked up on it at this point.
Yeah, I don't think that he picked up on that. Although he picks up on some other things about Shiv, I think. For instance, he says, you're angry with yourself and you tell yourself you're a good person, but you're not a good person, which I think is a pretty good read of Shiv, that she is, out of the siblings, she's the one that most presents herself as a progressive person. I mean, in season 1, she worked with a liberal candidate and kept saying that she actually supports his views, and she says she's blue, she's a Democrat, supposedly. She's always positioned herself in this way, but Kendall is the one to actually take a stand against what the company has done.
Yes, I felt like that was a very good read on Shiv, up there with Connor just saying, you're a brat, in Dundee. I feel like online there's often discussion of Kendall and Shiv being parallel characters, which I don't really necessarily agree with. I think at different points in the show you can draw a lot of different parallels between the characters, but I definitely felt it was true for this episode.
Yeah, I think the show doesn't necessarily do, like, parallel characters or foils as like a stable thing, but there are moments in which different characters are parallels or contrasts.
I also wanted to give a shout out to, in one of the trailers for this season, during the scene, Shiv said to Kendall, "You sound deranged." And I think the exclusion of that made her seem even more so like she's cozying up to him in this scene.
Yeah, and I think in the context of the scene, knowing what he meant by "I'm the real you," he didn't sound that deranged. He kind of explained what he meant by that. I loved the conversation between Logan and Connor.
You know it's bad when Logan is calling Connor, of all people, and just to like, hey, how you doing, son? You know you're my number one, right?
Yeah, that was a pretty desperate move for Logan to reach out to Connor. And it's clear he's kind of trying to keep him in the fold. He apologizes for his harsh words on the tin can, which I love that that's how he refers to the huge yacht they were on last season. The reaction from Connor was just heartbreaking to me because he said, "You're number one, kiddo." And after Connor hung up, he kind of looked at Willa and was like, "Oh, number one." And you could tell he kind of wanted to believe it, but knew it was just a manipulation tactic, is how I read that moment. And it just really made me feel for Connor, because he's been putting up with this for the longest.
Yeah, this was a really good Connor episode that I think made me feel very happy for him that he is so removed from everything generally.
Oh, yes. So we follow Greg sort of on his own side quest throughout the episode. So he first loops in apparently some friend he has who's in law school to try to get advice from her, and that doesn't really go that well. And then some lawyer who was sent by Waystar, and Jerry apparently, shows up at his door and sort of tries to become his lawyer and asks him questions. And this was just a sort of nerve-wracking scene because Greg is sort of a doofus. I mean, people always think he's really smart and conniving, and I don't really think he's that smart and conniving. And this scene was like, he very nearly was like, sure, come on into my home and things like that. I was like, no, Greg.
He's trying very hard to be very smart and conniving. I think it became very clear with this episode that he has no idea what he's doing. Even though at this point he seems to have realized how much danger they're in, he doesn't know what to do with any of it.
Yeah, he is way out of his depth and does not quite understand how any of this works, so he's a pretty easy person to take advantage of, which it's clear that Waystar knew because they tried to do exactly that and get someone that could speak on his behalf and ask him questions like, oh, has the FBI been in touch, and try to get some information from him. So I'm glad that he ultimately kind of wised up to that and said no, but it was painful to watch for a second.
It was very manipulative too, since it was not even clear to him that he was answering any question or agreeing to anything. They did it in a very smart way, and I'm proud of him.
Let's do location.
Venice, St. Bart's, the Maldives. Has she heard of these locations? She must be aware of them.
My favorite location of the episode was Sophie's bedroom. I just thought that it was a fun location, and I saw that somebody on Twitter had pointed out that on the wall there were some pictures of Sophie with Harry Styles and Billie Eilish, which I thought was a fun touch. And then I saw that the actress that plays her said that they were definitely photoshopped. She did not actually get to meet them. Because for a second I was like, I wonder if she actually had, selfies with these people if she went to a concert and had some kind of VIP. But apparently no, they were not real pictures, so that's too bad.
I'm so sad to hear that.
And I just thought this was a fun location for the conversation between the Roy siblings where they're reminiscing on their past and their own childhood. It was sort of fun to put them back in time in a little bit in what is clearly a child's bedroom.
I feel like it was a very inspired choice for this scene and made for some good physical comedy, with Kendall sitting on the little chair. Something I want to note for location is that, so Greg lives in Tribeca at Cast Iron House. He met Ewan in Cooper Square. It's about a mile between these locations. If he had taken the subway, this would have been 5 minutes. But he took a Lyft, which is at least 10-15 minutes, which just really disturbed me when I realized that. He's just gone full Roy, because that seems insane.
So back at Kendall headquarters, he has a brief conversation with Lisa and the rest of the legal team, who are beginning to appear a little bit anxious and need to start putting their plan together. And it appears that Kendall still kind of thinks that his dad is invincible, because he says he could shut the whole thing down. And one of my other favorite lines from this episode was, "We might need to get the state police to arrest the FBI." And I don't know, is that something that can happen? Maybe I'm just dumb and that is something that can happen, but I was like, what?
I mean, I love that you're kind of asking me this, but I don't know either. It does sound like no, I would say. I feel like this conversation made it clear that Kendall's in a very similar place to Roman in this episode. They are still convinced their dad is infallible. And I thought Lisa was really good in the scene, seeing her reaction as she realized, I think, wow, this boy is very seriously traumatized.
This brought up one of my theories for this season that used to be kind of a joke theory, but after this episode, I am fully on board. I don't think that Kendall has any papers that are actually useful, and I will outline my evidence for this theory. So, when Greg tells Kendall that he has the papers at the end of season 1, he actually does have a large, number of them. He probably copied, maybe a few hundred things. He actually got to kind of look at them and maybe was, choosing the ones that seemed more important when he was shredding them. So he had a decent number of them, right? But then, during season 2, he told Tom that he had them for some reason, and Tom made him burn most of them. And in that episode, in Return, when they're out on the balcony burning them, there's a moment when Tom goes inside, and Greg is able to grab, maybe generously, 10 individual pieces of paper that have been soaked in kerosene and, stuff them down his pants and save them. So at this point, he has 10 papers chosen indiscriminately from this pile on the fire. He didn't get to look at them and make sure he had the most important ones or whatever. He just has, a few of them. And I was totally, willing to believe that he had something that was useful. I was not going to question it. I was just kind of joking about it. But at this point with Kendall is saying to Shiv, oh yeah, I have the papers. I just can't show them to you yet. Or Lisa hasn't seen the papers yet. He's trying to get out of handing them over to the government. To me, if he has those papers, he would just hand them over. I don't know. I guess maybe he's oh, I don't want my dad to go to jail. But I really think that it's possible with kind of the setup we saw on this front this season. I don't think he has anything, and I think he knows that. I think the wheels are already in motion. He rolled up to, I don't know, maybe they stopped by Greg's apartment before they went to the press conference, and they already had the plan, and Greg's here's what I have, and Kendall saw it, and he was oh shit, well, I'm gonna do it anyway. That now is what I think happened. He was already so set on doing it that he was well, I'm gonna do it anyway. It'll be fine. This is the first theory that I've had this season, but I am fully on board for this.
I loved that, and after this episode, I am fully on board with the idea that Kendall has no useful papers. I think there is no reason for Lisa to not have them, and I kind of got him not showing them to Shiv, but the way he talked about it, oh, they're getting copied. Why haven't they already been copied, Kendall?
Yeah.
And saying, but, I got them.
The only other explanation is that he truly doesn't want his dad to go to jail, and that's why he wouldn't hand them over, but I don't think that makes as much sense at this point as him just not actually having anything. So then Roman shows up at the party. There's a lot of fun sibling moments, even though it's a tense atmosphere. I think at the beginning of the scene there's some cute moments.
Roman brought him pastries. Everyone is just trying to feed Kendall in this episode. And we noted in the last episode that Roman has kind of done a 180 on Kendall, and I feel like this episode really showed that the number one thing bothering Roman, more than any actual problems that Kendall has caused, is that Roman asked Kendall on the yacht how he was doing, and Kendall didn't answer him honestly, and then Roman found out how he was doing on a press conference on national TV.
That's so true. He's I tried to reach out to you, brother. Yeah, and I also liked the conversation where they kind of tried to find out how long he'd been planning this, because I think from their perspective, it appears oh, he must have been planning this for a long time, and that definitely feels more of a betrayal for him to not have looped them in if it's been months or whatever. And then he says it was kind of a last minute thing, and then Roman goes, that was spontaneous? And Kendall's not fully willing to admit it was spontaneous, because I think he doesn't want to seem even more deranged than he already does, but I think it pretty much was spontaneous. He says he talked to a lawyer, and I just want to meet the lawyer. Who did he talk to who was you shouldn't do this? And Kendall's yeah, but I'm going to, though.
It could even be him saying, oh yeah, I spoke to a lawyer. Didn't actually speak to a lawyer.
Yeah.
I also love how unapologetic he is still. He mentions having a certain amount of regret, as he also said to Stewie in our Jestes.
Yeah, he's like, I must only apologize via press conference statements, which is your whole problem in the first place, Kendall, is that your loved ones want you to speak to them normally, and you can only get up there and read off your little note cards. So Greg and Ewan are reunited here. I always like these two because, for one thing, they're both very, very tall. And I just love that because they look normal sized next to each other. Ewan scenes are a lot like Jeremy Strong interviews in that you need a dictionary to get the most out of them.
Very true. I think they both have a very similar old man energy, and they're just passionate about different things. I really loved Ewan in this scene, referring to Kendall as Greg's friend when he's a family member to both of them.
And then I enjoyed the line, I found his performance histrionic and meretricious. I say that right? I was like, I'm looking up both of these words. Apparently it means overly theatrical and melodramatic, and apparently attractive but having no real value. So I was like, oh, that's a good burn. I'll give him that one.
Everyone is roasting this press conference. Rava didn't even listen to it. Ewan is just completely insulting it, and I find it very funny since I think as a fandom, all the viewers are very much like, wow, this is really cool and empowering.
Yeah, it was definitely like a mic drop moment from the perspective of the fans, and it has been fan cammed to death. I love the Taylor Swift "Look What You Made Me Do" redux of that scene. It's great.
Yes, look that up.
So I think it's a good perspective to see that, like, in universe, people think this is kind of a ridiculous move, and we're probably just making fun of him on Twitter. So I guess there's not maybe that much difference between the fandom and the real life as far as people just kind of roasting Kendall on Twitter all the time.
It's also a bit different, I think, watching it on TV probably as like news as opposed to a television show.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably true. The general public has not been privy to Kendall's emotional abuse at the hands of his father for years, so they're not quite cheering him on in the same way that we are. I also loved that this scene ended with Greg's unreciprocated "I love you" that he shouts to his grandpa. He's the most willing to show familial affection. He's always trying to hug everyone in the Roy family, and they're like, what are you doing? It's just very cute because he's like, this is what I'm supposed to do with my family, right? And everyone's just really cold and unemotional to him, but he doesn't stop trying. Bless his heart.
I think Greg belongs in a different family.
He belongs in my family. He's my cousin now. Let's do best line.
Words are just, nothing. Complicated airflow.
So my favorite line from this episode was actually from Greg. It was when he says to Ewan about Kendall, I think he's very much on the same page as you, if it doesn't sound too basic to be like good. This line really showed Kendall's influence on him. Like, is that too earnest? Is that too basic to be like good and do a good thing here?
We want to do a good thing. And it's very cute that he doesn't he thinks that Ewan and Kendall could be on the same side and that, like, their definitions of good are going to be compatible.
Yeah, I think he's like, well, these are both people who have very strong values and both want to be good, so they can be good together.
My favorite line was when Kendall said, "We are a declining empire inside a declining empire." This is a line I've been thinking about the most since I watched this episode because it definitely exposes some of like the central meaning of the show. So I loved it. I was like, oh, they said the thing, because I had read some Jeremy Strong interviews from over the summer, and I gotta say, I'm now a little bit less impressed with him making this connection now that I know it's just like textually in the show, like he was basically just quoting the show. But I was like, wow, Jeremy is so smart for saying that Waystar is an analogy for the decline of the American empire and like the end of the American century of the 20th century as we move into the 21st, and now it's like, you know, a new thing. And I thought that was a really cool kind of read of the show. And now I realize that Jeremy Strong is actually just directly quoting the show, but he still gets props for it. He got to look really, really smart to me for a few months, which is worth it. No, he's still really smart. I'm not roasting him. I'm just saying I was like, oh, I thought that was like a conclusion he came to independently, and it's not literally something his character said.
The one thing I will say in defense of Jeremy is, since there seems to be a lot of conversation between the actors and Jesse on the show is maybe this line was actually born out of a conversation between them.
Okay.
And it was, in fact, Jeremy's idea.
Okay, that is very, I didn't consider that, but I will fully cede to that point. That is 100% true. It could have been something that they were discussing about the meaning of the show that he brought up and then worked its way into dialogue. The centerpiece of this episode is the long scene between all 4 Roy siblings are finally in a room together, and it's great. This was definitely my favorite scene, probably like of the season so far, which, I mean, there's only been 2 episodes, but still.
So, and I loved Connor's intro, the "oh sure thing, honey, me too, we're all here for Dad." Connor is the only one being honest here about his intentions.
It's clear that they're all considering it a little bit, but they can't really express how seriously they're thinking about it in front of everyone else. They all have to hedge a little bit and say, oh, I'm just spying on you, or I'm just trying to talk you down from it.
Yeah, I saw some people note that Kendall shouldn't have walked away to visit Stewie, but I thought that was actually good and seemed to encourage them all to actually talk to each other about it.
Oh, that's a good point. Whether or not that was... I kind of doubt that was part of his strategy. I don't think it was at all, but I think that's true. It kind of gave them some time to think about it without him in the room.
Kendall gave his pitch, and Shiv, we know from the past, is very susceptible to buzzwords, particularly when it's framed through a progressive lens. It was absolutely wild to listen to Kendall's speech and see the look on her face like, he's making some very good points.
It was an interesting pitch. I mean, I think he understands the problem really well, but I don't know if he's quite grasped the solution. And I saw somebody say on Twitter, a point that I thought was really good is that, like, for them to reposition Waystar as basically this global monopoly of information is actually worse morally and for the world than what Waystar is right now, because to control news and information for the entire world to the degree that Kendall's kind of pitching there is kind of a horrifying concept. So even though Kendall's like, yeah, when my dad did it, it was bad, but when I do it, it'll be good, it's just like not something that anyone can say, because the whole kind of thesis of the show is that power is a corrupting and corrosive influence, and that nobody should really have the amount of power and wealth and influence that these characters have, because nobody can manage it and can actually do good with it. That kind of broke apart at the end, but you know what I'm saying.
Nobody can actually do good things by running Waystar, and like splitting the entire world up between these 4 siblings is not even. That's not saving the world, Kendall.
Yeah, like the actual moral thing for him to do would just be like break apart the company, basically. And I think this scene is really the closest that the show comes to the characters sitting around and outright saying what the themes of the show are. And I think this is something a lot of shows do. I watched The White Lotus on HBO recently and kind of hated it for this reason, was because I just thought it...
Oh, me too.
Oh, you too? You hated it too?
Yeah.
I didn't...
We should
talk about that. I didn't like it. And I think, like, comparing it to that, I think what made this scene more interesting and, like, made it work for me is that the characters aren't just sitting around a dinner table and being like, here's what I believe. Like, there are actual stakes, like they're trying to convince each other of something, and they're also trying to somewhat like disguise what their own feelings are. So there's more layers you can read into it rather than them just saying like, here's some interesting things you could think about the show and about our world and how those relate to each other. But one thing that Roman said was, like, if Dad didn't do this, then somebody else would have done the same thing. And Kendall's like, well, true, but I think he does really believe that, like, the people that are running it make a difference, and he doesn't really see that the whole problem is the system. We live in a society.
We live in a society. That is the episode. I feel like if the first episode was characters making phone calls, this was characters sitting in rooms and talking.
Which I prefer.
We say we're on a phone call. I feel like it was very much a character study this episode, which was supported by what Jesse said in the after show for this episode. The setup is somewhat similar to Shit Show, but there was almost no change in the status quo, really. There's very little plot. Like you said, it's very heavy on themes and character. and I think it was very much needed.
Yeah, and I think, like, it answers the question of why don't the siblings, take this chance, and I think that is a question that does need to be taken very seriously for us to buy the rest of the season. Because I think if it feels weak right now that, like, well, why don't they all just team up against Logan? We're not going to really fully buy into what happens later. So I understand, like, taking the time to do all of this, although I know at this point it feels like, okay, now I'm ready for the rest of the season to start and to get into really the meat of the plot of the season, which feels like we haven't seen yet. This feels very much like a reaction to the end of season 2 still.
Oh yeah, it's very much a reaction and felt somewhat like a response to the whole, if they just teamed up against Logan, then they would win. And this episode does not dispute that, but does a good job of showing why, even at this point, they cannot bring themselves to do it. I really loved Shiv in this scene in particular, the whole "we knew" conversation with Kendall and Connor. I think it showed how, Shiv's always had a very different view of Logan and Waystar, and I think this conversation showed how her age played a huge role in that. And also on some level, I feel like she's a, smart, savvy woman, and even if she didn't know the details, I feel like she could have assumed that Waystar was covering up some kind of stuff like this, and I feel like this conversation showed that she is very much, she's been a bit disillusioned, I think, by the Cruises scandal.
Yeah, I think this conversation was my favorite part of the scene. How the two oldest siblings are very adamant that they knew, and they're kind of insisting that, well, if I knew, that means that all my siblings must have known, even though it's clear, like, they've never talked about this before. Like, it's been something that they have just never brought up with each other. So I kind of read this as, Kendall, who is one of the older siblings and who has been more involved in the company for a longer period of time and at a higher level than any of his other siblings, he totally knew. He totally knew probably everything that his, like, almost everything that his dad knew. So I can see this as him kind of trying to alleviate some of his own guilt for not having acted sooner by saying, well, you guys knew too, we all knew. And I think, like, Roman and Shiv, I don't think they're lying here. Like, I think it's very possible that they did not know to the same extent that Kendall knew. And especially because I think that Shiv is the youngest. I think she's quite a bit younger, which isn't necessarily confirmed, but the ages in the original pilot script, to really cite my sources here, Shiv is almost, 10 years younger than Kendall, so she is quite a bit younger. And I also just wanted to bring up how I thought, like, her gender played into this, because Connor was saying, like, oh, there were all these creepy old men hanging around Dad all the time, and, like, oh, you don't get in the pool with them. And she was like, well, of course I didn't get in the pool with them. I was a 15-year-old girl. So I think from her perspective, it's like, well, I just thought they were normal creepy. Like, I didn't know they were, like, sinister creepy. I thought they were just, like, the way that old men are creepy to 15-year-old girls, which I think is, like, sort of a telling thing to say, but I couldn't really blame her for that, honestly.
They are very much still seeing this as an isolated problem, Kendall and Connor, and she's like, yeah, they were old men. Like, you inherently can't trust them.
The Queen has returned. Marcia is back. I am pretty happy to see her back on the show, honestly. I just think it's kind of fun for her to be back, and especially as, like, Logan is, gaining power at the end of this episode, it makes sense for her to be, folded back in.
I'm glad to have her back, since we get to see a very different side of Logan through Marcia, him being more vulnerable. I'm glad that, if nothing else, what we got out of that press conference is that Marcia is going to get a really good financial deal for herself and her family.
Oh, yes, she is.
It was a great scene. I love that she waited for him to acknowledge some sort of wrongdoing before executing the sexy lapel touch.
I think what I've always liked about, like, Marcia is I think her character, like, there are certain scenes that I think of as kind of being like a decoder ring in Succession, like the thing that, like, if you understand this scene, you can kind of apply it to everything else. And I really think, like, early season 1 Marcia is very much that, because Shiv thinks that she's scheming all these power moves, but in reality, she just actually kind of, like cares about Logan and is like focused on him getting better and is doing what he wants her to do, which is keep his children away while he recovers. People in the show are not always scheming when you think they're scheming. Sometimes they just actually care about people. So I've always kind of liked her role for that reason.
Yes, and it's kind of hilarious how the kids just cannot understand that she's actually a person who's upfront and just cares about this person.
Yeah.
Like, it's incomprehensible.
Yeah. Which says more about them than her. Let's do number one boy.
You're my boy. You're my number one boy.
My number one boy this episode, and I would not have guessed this going in, it was Connor. I felt so fond of him. I'm still interpreting, number one boy as like, I want to hug him and tell him that he's my number one boy, which I would do completely sincerely, by the way, not in the way that Logan did it this episode. I just felt like the moment of him reacting to that on the phone was so sad, and he brought a really interesting perspective this episode. Being the oldest, I think that really shined here and showed how he can bring a unique perspective to these conversations, since he's probably at least 10, maybe 15 years older than Kendall. He has a lot more experience being around the family, and he kind of played a mediator role here. He called out Shiv on some of her bullshit and went to comfort Roman. I would still love to know what exactly he said to Roman, but I just thought it was a nice role for him. And one last thing I want to shout out is that I loved when the rest of the siblings were making their phone calls, trying to figure out what to do about this situation. He was apparently calling his like wine storage guy to try to figure out where the best place was to store his fine wines. Never change, baby. I love you.
I really loved Connor in this episode. He was my runner-up. Particularly loved the scene with him comforting Roman. Especially, I think it's very easy to forget that Kendall is actually a middle child, and the scene with Kendall and Shiv staying behind and continuing to laugh about Roman, you could definitely see it. My number one boy for this episode was Roman.
Nice.
I just really felt for him in this episode. He was trying insanely hard to be a good spy for his daddy, and you could also see just his emotions about Kendall on full display, his middle child antics on full display, touching Sophie's shit, specifically because Kendall told him not to, firing insult after insult. I just wanted to ruffle his hair.
And his hair was very ruffleable. Great answer. Now, the return of one of my favorite characters in the show, Stewie. The much, I don't even want to say underappreciated, because I think fans appreciate him plenty, but underutilized. Every moment he's on screen, he is serving. So first we get a mention that he is the one who sent this Trojan horse to Kendall's place, which is hilarious and amazing. Where did he get that? He has a Trojan horse guy, and
he is a Trojan horse guy, and he pulled this very dramatic, gay move, as one does when your former bestie does a press conference like that.
I think my hope for Stewie is that he doesn't immediately fold to what Kendall's, offering here. And it does seem like he's not. I mean, he said, we're all ears, but I don't see it, dude. I think he's not quite buying what Kendall is selling here, which I like for him. I don't think this necessarily changes their position. It just makes the vote probably even easier for them at this point.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of speculation that this would bring Kendall and Stewie closer, maybe, and that Stewie would be calling him, and I really loved for him that Stewie did not call him at all. Kendall had to call him multiple times, apparently, to set up this meeting.
He pulls a Rava and is like, oh, I haven't had a chance to see it yet. Sorry, but I heard it was great. We also get the introduction of Sandy Furness's daughter, and I heard that apparently the actor who plays the older Sandy is just not appearing in this season, so that is probably the reason for the introduction of this new character, Sandy with an I.
I think it was a very funny way to deal with that, and I almost wish I wasn't spoiled, because I think the reveal they did where you couldn't see Sandy in the car as Kendall was greeting Sandy was great.
I also liked how Kendall insisted that it must be as personal for Sandy as everything is for the Roy family.
Kendall was very interesting this scene. I think he clearly felt Logan was their only issue with the deal, and Kendall is the one who very personally screwed over Stewie and Sandy. He had to deal with them, and I feel like even outside of the fact that they have no reason to do this because they're about to win, I feel like Kendall is not showing any awareness for how he's fucked up here, and I don't think he realizes still how much he hurt Stewie by doing that.
Yeah, he thinks that they're just gonna jump right back into their old plan, which doesn't really make sense from their perspective. Why should they trust Kendall? I don't see it, dude. So back to the other Roy siblings inside. Shiv and Connor are both saying, yeah, this would be it for Dad if we all moved against him. But Roman won't admit to that or just doesn't believe that that's true, which I think is really interesting to show kind of his, headspace. And he thinks that his dad is invincible, which has been a common thread with him throughout the series, I think.
Oh yeah, it's an if Logan dies.
He might not die. And when Kendall comes back in from his meeting with Sandy and Stewie, it seems like he's either lying or exaggerating because we never really saw the end of that, and I just find it a little unbelievable that they agreed to his terms, and we know he's been lying about other things, so just don't totally buy that. I think they're still likely going towards a shareholder vote with the takeover and everything. It just seems likely, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think Kendall is 100% lying here, assuming that if he gets him on board, then maybe Stewie and Sandy will change their minds. Kendall is really just saying words at this point. He mentions he's going to outsource his feelings about his dad to his therapist. I am doubtful that he even has a therapist and is not just using that as part of the whole thing.
Oh yeah, if he does have a therapist, how long have you had a therapist, Kendall? Throughout all of season 2, did you have a therapist? Somehow I doubt that.
Kendall made an appointment with a therapist for the first time right before this conversation. He's like, I have a therapist, I'll talk to the therapist about it.
That's gonna be a lot to catch that therapist up on. Maybe you should just watch this show called Succession and then we'll start talking after that. And everything starts to fall apart when they start talking about leadership and who is going to actually become CEO, which is always the question. Why are these people so obsessed with CEO? We'll never know.
It's the number one boy is the CEO.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I know it's just like a stand-in for what they actually want, which is love and acceptance, but they'll never get that, so they have to become CEO instead. None of them can handle having to work for one of their siblings, so this is where it really just becomes a deal breaker, because Shiv is like, it has to be me, and Shiv, what are you talking about?
Well, Kendall put this in a very misogynistic way, but I think Shiv is thinking at this point, well, I'm the only girl, they really need a girl right now, so this can be my in. And I felt like this was also really illuminating as far as both their opinions about each other and of each other's relationships to Logan. I disagree with Kendall. I think Logan would absolutely send Shiv to jail if it was between the two of them. This tells us something that Kendall believes, or at least doubts, that Logan would do that to Shiv. And we also see another parallel between Kendall and Shiv when Kendall insults Shiv and denies responsibility by saying, I don't think that, but the market does. Which to me felt very similar to in Shit Show when, again, they're discussing the CEO position, hot topic that tends to cause them all to hate each other. And Shiv rips into him, saying he lacks killer instinct, you're white, you're green. I don't think of that, I'm just trying to be Dad's voice.
Yes, I love that parallel. And then it's very clear that they do both actually think that. That's what other people would think. I don't think that, though.
As becomes clear, I think, at the end of the episode when they actually get really mad at each other, it becomes clear you just actually think these things. You wouldn't otherwise say it.
Exactly. So then they sort of break to go and talk to their various people, and I think from the phone call with Tom, it does seem like Shiv is probably the most on board, and Roman is he's thinking about it. He's not thinking about it.
Roman's thinking about it. He's asking his mom.
He's asking his mom girlfriend.
Shiv made me very sad here. She only tells Tom things when she needs advice. We saw the same thing with the CEO position in season 2.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, yeah, he offered it to me, by the way. Also, should I do it? And this is like, oh, yeah, I'm at Kendall's, by the way. Also, should I do it? And he's like, okay, you could have told me that sooner, but that's fine. You just lied before.
Similarly, I think she's still not being upfront about what she wants. She's like kind of a panicked face and like, I don't know if I can actually do this, and not being direct. She had no reason to lie to Tom before about being at Kendall's. He's not going to sell her out, but I think it doesn't even occur to her to be honest with her husband unless she could, like, get something out of it.
Yes, exactly. It's like, oh my god, it's like in the wedding episode when Jerry's like, have you told the kids yet? And Logan's like, well, what's the advantage? And she's like, well, just to tell them. Yeah, this family, man. Let them eat cake.
Let us eat cake. I mean,
My let them eat cake moment from this episode was all the wasted food in this episode. Roman does not just bring Kendall, like, pastries in a bag. They're like gift-wrapped pastries that just sit on the table the whole episode. And also, no one eats the dozen donuts that Logan bought for 4 people.
They look so good.
They looked good. Connor tries, but then gives up. And I think, I mean, if my sibling screamed at me like that, I would at least grab one of the donuts my dad bought me before running out.
My let them eat cake was at the beginning of the phone call between Connor and Logan. Connor said, we flew back scheduled, so that was fine. And then Logan's like, I'm sorry, son, that's tough. And then Connor says, it was fine. They had movies and a selection of heavily refrigerated cheeses. I've never heard anyone refer to flying scheduled before, but it was immediately apparent that it's just like, that's just like a non-private flight. Like, that's a flight with other people. It's been scheduled. So I just thought that was like, oh, now I have a new thing in my vocabulary. Connor and Willa barely survived their ordeal in first class with the movies and the cheese, and we're like, man, it was pretty bad. We had to fly scheduled.
It was so funny because, I mean, not all flights even have movies or, like, cheeses. I feel like to everyone else that'd be exciting. Oh, the flight had movies. It was a great flight.
All right, so the donuts.
The donut.
The donuts about which much has already been written, I think.
Yes, and I would like to give a shout out to the Succession Twitter. They've been doing giveaways for each episode, and this week sent people a dozen donuts each, along with a little card that is the card Logan gives the kids in the episode, which I think is very cute.
Yeah, and I remember when we found out it was donuts, we were like, donuts? Because this was before the episode had aired. We were like, why are they giving out donuts? So now I was like, oh, donuts. That's actually really cute. I love how the donuts were Logan's way of being in the room, and like with the vote, none of them can betray him while he's in the room. It is the thing that breaks everything apart.
I don't think these donuts were poisoned. I don't think he would go through that much effort, and I think he knew that all he had to do was be in the room in some form. It was also very patronizing. It felt like, you know, they were kids having a little party in the basement, and he sent them down some snacks.
And when all the siblings refuse to come along, Kendall immediately turns very, very cruel, which was hard to watch. And the order in which he asked them seemed a little crucial. I mean, Connor did volunteer first. You know, I'm out, I'm not doing it. And he's like, oh, you're not wanted anyway. Then he asks Roman directly, which I think makes it impossible for Shiv if she was leaning that way, which I think she really was leaning that way. After everyone's out, she can't stay in.
I think you can tell from her reaction to Roman saying no. I think you can tell that she was about to say yes. I think if at least one of the other siblings had said yes, or if Shiv had gone first, then that might have motivated the other siblings to say yes.
It not only didn't work out, but he just burned the bridge. I think especially with Shiv, I mean, what he said to Shiv was very cruel. And like, whether or not what he says is true, I think people are like, well, he wasn't wrong though. Yeah, but that's still really mean to say to your siblings. I don't think it doesn't help him in this situation, and it's mean. Like, if they get a chance later this season to join with him again, they are not going to forget how he treated them in this moment.
Yes, I think he could have saved some face here and maintained some stability with the siblings, but instead a very Logan move where he's just reacting completely emotionally. I really like too how his own insecurities showed through a bit while he was insulting them. He said to Roman, "You think I can't win?" And interestingly, he didn't seem to think that was the reason for Shiv at all. He felt confident that she believed him.
I love how he just catastrophized and was like, you're fucking the company and the country and probably the planet. Like, Kendall, just like take a beat. And I read something about a take that they cut.
As did I.
They left the camera rolling after his siblings left, and Jeremy Strong did a take where he attacked the donuts and like pounded them into the table or something like that. And I feel like that would have added a little something here for me. I think that we didn't get any of Kendall alone this episode. We got a brief moment at the beginning of last week's episode, and I think it would have been nice to have a little moment where we kind of get his headspace, where he's not just reacting to everyone around him, and for him to kind of let that rage out. We haven't really had a temper tantrum from Kendall in a while, so...
Also loved that the article very specifically said he pounded the donuts.
Pounded the donuts. And that was like Mylod who said that, right? Mark Mylod?
Yeah. I would just love to see, at least on the cutting room floor, what it looks like for Jeremy Strong to just pound some donuts.
I know. If they ever released outtakes or deleted scenes, it would be over for me. I would be so happy forever. Speaking of sweet treats, let's do Candy Baby.
Ugh. Hot. Ugh.
I loved that transition.
Thank you.
My candy baby for this episode is Marsha.
Nice.
I don't know if it's because we haven't seen her in a while, but immediately when she walked into that hotel room lobby, I was like, okay, I think this may be my candy baby for the episode. She is looking fantastic and clearly knows this and dressed for the occasion, and I love that for her.
I love that choice. She was really like vibing with Logan too. Like there was a vibe there.
It was very sexy.
She was giving off some, as Roman would say, some like fucky eyes at Logan, which was it was a good look for her.
Who is yours? I am really on the edge of my seat.
Yeah, so it's not a surprise to Savannah or anyone who knows me, but my candy baby was Stewie. Stewie is my favorite, minor character in the show, and it's not just because he's super hot, but he is in fact super hot. I just have a really big crush on both Stewie and Arian Moayed. I'll just put it out there. Yeah. So, and I thought like the leather jacket he was wearing.
Oh yeah, Stewie's in a leather jacket.
Good. And I heard that Arian got to keep that leather jacket, so I am really, really happy for him. And just the way he was like leaning against the car, he was in this for like 2 minutes, but like still, his eyes looking back and forth between the two people who were talking in the scene as he wasn't talking. Oh, great. I love like standing a minor character this much. His face was half shadowed. I will take what I can get. I don't really care that much. It was all working for me. And anytime, we don't know how many episodes that Stewie's going to be in. So whenever he is here, I just have to give him the honors of Candy Baby.
I wish everyone could see the energy that you just had describing all this.
I was like very animated talking with my hands about how hot Stewie is.
Which you don't always talk with your hands.
I know, I suddenly just like went for it. I have a lot of feelings about Stewie.
He was very hot in this episode. I felt confident that he would be your candy baby, so I did not mean to shout it out myself.
Yes.
That was beautiful.
I respect you, like, letting me have my territory. So back to Logan. He has a short conversation with Marsha that seems to be setting some more groundwork for the manslaughter incident, the vehicular manslaughter incident, to come out or be used in some way. She says, you have things you could use to stop him, and Logan says, you drop some bombs, you get burned too, which seems like a very a very good response from his part. I mean, I think it totally makes sense why Logan is unwilling to use this, especially publicly, because he himself covered up the crime. Like, they would both be going down together for this. Logan can't really use it without implicating himself, just as Kendall can't quite bring down the company without implicating himself. Oh my god, I love a toxic father-son duo locked in mutually assured destruction. It's my favorite dynamic. But yeah, it does seem like the seeds are being planted here, and I'm sure that it will come to fruition at some point this season.
So I'm very glad this exchange happened, since I feel like a lot of people have brought up why isn't Kendall worried that Logan is going to bring this out against him, and I feel like this scene made it very clear why not. Logan was never really going to blackmail him with the car crash. It was just emotional blackmail, making him feel that he was not worth being part of this world. He was done for.
The heart of it was to kind of make him feel like, I know what you did, Kendall, but I still love you and will accept you, but no one else would. Like, that kind of vibe was like somewhat what I got from it, especially from the number one boy thing and giving him that support in that moment that I think Kendall knows he can't get from anyone else. So even with how toxic the rest of their relationship is, there was that kind of understanding that Logan still loves him even after knowing that.
And I loved the line from Logan in this scene, people need to see a little family unity, which to me felt very meta, since as an audience member, my heart had just been broken seeing the siblings split apart like that.
I would love to see some family unity. I liked how in his phone call with Roman, I was a little bit touched by how Roman stood with Shiv and you know, wasn't going to give her up or sell her out in any way.
So it's nice to see that if they're with Logan, they might continue to have some solidarity, at least with each other. They've been a pretty strong unit this season so far, actually. They had a lot of... So what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Which is really nice to see.
So it looks like Greg is now going to be the poster child for anti-capitalism. He meets with some guy who Ewan knows, who's sort of like an activist lawyer who wants to use Greg to kind of make some points about the internal contradictions of capitalism. So I just think it's funny that, like, even Ewan is just gonna use Greg for his other purposes here, and Greg is getting pulled in so many different directions here, but he's like, all right, okay, that sounds cool.
This is a really funny kind of subplot for Greg, I think. Also love that the first priority that he stated to this lawyer, but we're even mentioning not wanting to go to jail, was not wanting to get fired from his job at Waystar.
Yes, that is actually a really good point that he didn't say. Well, I mean, the lawyer kind of said, like, our priority is making sure that you don't go to jail. So, yeah, I guess, like, to be fair, the lawyer said that. But Greg then said, actually, you know, my kind of top priority is keeping my job, was the one thing that he himself, you know, called out, which is sort of ridiculous that he hasn't realized by now that that's not going to work so well, buddy. Buddy, are you serious?
This episode we saw a return to him being a little more ambitious and focused on himself.
Yeah.
But it's also still very clear that he is written to be in his 20s. I think it was 26 he was originally written to be, was mentioned in an interview. And yeah, it was very relatable, I felt.
And we close the episode out with some family unity. Roman plays along with the paparazzi shots and goes out and hugs his dad. Shiv does not. She stays in the car.
Which felt very similar to Austerlitz. After the family therapy, Roman is the only one who sticks by his dad for the paparazzi.
And Shiv is really the only one who will consistently call Logan out on his shit, so she thanks him for the donuts when they're in the car together, which was pretty funny. I can't really see any of the other siblings even acknowledging that.
They'd be terrified too. We've definitely seen with Shiv that she's able to lash out at Logan a bit more than her siblings, which I don't think is because she is the favorite, but because Logan does not take her as seriously as the others.
And the final note of the episode is that Shiv gets a promotion to spy on Jerry.
Yes, Logan is just approaching each of his children now like, okay, I'm sorry to let you be CEO, but you can be my super secret spy. you can't tell anyone, but it's like really important.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. He's like, this is even more important than CEO, actually. You're like the real CEO when you think about it. And Shiv's like, cool, okay.
CEO really is the number one boy. He's just going around to everyone, you're actually the CEO.
You're actually my favorite. Yep, you're my number one. Let's close out with buy or sell.
Sell seems cool.
I am selling Kendall.
I've been able to predict your answers pretty well this time.
Yeah,
which I'm proud of.
Looking at how this episode played out, it just feels like things are very much on a downward trend for Kendall. I'm probably selling still quite a bit above his rock bottom, but that's just a sound investment strategy, really. I'm going to make a little bit of money before he completely tanks on this sale, because I can see where things are going and it is not pretty. I don't think he has the papers. All of his siblings there's like no hope of them joining up with him, I'm sure, for the rest of the season. It's probably going to take a pretty long time for him to rebuild those relationships. Greg is flopping on him.
His best friend.
His best friend, Greg. It's not great. So I have to sell Kendall. I am buying Marcia because I want a cut of her divorce, of her non-divorce settlement. That's what you get when you don't divorce someone. And she just had the best point to come back in when Logan really needed her and was willing to, basically do anything except maybe say that he's sorry to, make things right. So she has a lot of leverage here, both, personally with Logan, as well as with the trust and with getting things for her children. And I just loved what her lawyer said. So this is going to sound like a really high number until you consider how bad it would be to have an acrimonious divorce announced ahead of a contested shareholder vote. Then it's going to sound like very reasonable numbers, which I just thought was a great line.
It was a fantastic line.
Who are you selling and buying?
I considered selling Kendall, but I decided I was not ready to do that yet. I think as you mentioned, he has further to fall, and just emotionally I cannot do that yet. I'm selling Shiv.
Okay.
I actually really loved Shiv in this episode. I empathized with her a lot more than I have in previous episodes. I don't think siding with Kendall would have been the best choice, but I think emotionally this would have been a good step for her. And I think we already saw her starting to regret it at the end of the episode, which is not a good sign. So I am selling Shiv, but I am sad about it.
Yeah, I understand.
And I am buying Stewie for this episode.
Nice.
Love that we are both just buying each other's candy babies.
Yes. We're gonna have a conversation about that. That's my candy baby.
So for buy and sell, I've been sorting all the characters into buy and sell and then choosing who I most want to talk about.
That is so much more organized than I'm doing. I'm just vibe based, and it's the first one I think of, and I'm like, yes. Although I did consider Shiv for sell.
For this episode, I actually was selling almost everyone, whereas last week it was a little more split. But with Ken Stark Greg Co falling apart, it is just not looking good for either Team Logan or Team Kendall at this point to me. I think that they are going to destroy each other and themselves fighting over the CEO position. And meanwhile, Stewie and Sandy are very well positioned, and I think they're going to go places.
I agree. That's a very, very sound investment.
They are the only ones with their eye on the money, so I am putting my money on them.
Well, this wraps up this week, and we will be back next week to talk about episode 3.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening. This could have been in one of those emails, and then Jesse was in the middle of writing his script and just wrote it in. So that's...
Jeremy sent Jesse the Terminal Decadence article, and Jesse was like, okay.
Yeah.
Jesse sent him just a, yeah, cool, back, and then it worked its way into the script.
And then Jeremy was like, my influence. We're writing fan fiction is what we're doing right now.